At 81 years old, Sam Elliott has spent nearly 6 decades standing beside some of the greatest names in Hollywood history, on screen and off. In an industry that burns through most people long before they reach anything close to that kind of longevity. He kept coming back, kept working, and kept building something that most actors never managed to build at all. A body of work that actually means something to the people who made it with him. 5 of those people mean more to him than the rest. 5 names he's carried with him, returned to in interviews, and spoken about with a consistency that tells you these aren't just polite answers to a reporter's question. They're the real ones. And what makes the list genuinely worth paying attention to is where it goes. 2 of those 5 are already gone. 2 more are still active today, decades on from the projects that first brought them together. The 5th name isn't really a co-star by any traditional definition, which makes it the most interesting entry on the list. Elliott has never framed these 5 as a ranking or treated the list like some kind of career highlight reel. He's simply talked, honestly and repeatedly, over the years, about what each person actually gave him, what each one changed, and why each one still matters. So, let's go through all 5 of them, starting with the first. Number 1 is Robert Redford. And the reason Redford makes this list at all comes down to one of the stranger accidents of timing in Elliott's early career. The film was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, released in 1969, and it became the highest-grossing movie of that entire year. Redford played the title outlaw opposite Paul Newman in what was already shaping up to be one of the defining films of its era. Elliott was there too, technically credited as card player number 2, essentially a glorified extra somewhere in the background of a bar scene. He was nobody on that set, and he knew it. He said plainly that he never once worked up the nerve to speak to the film's leading lady, let alone its biggest star. He described himself at that point as nothing more than a shadow on the wall, present but invisible, watching history being made from the very edge of the frame. It wasn't a complaint. It was just the honest truth of where he stood at that moment in his life. Redford, of course, went on to define the next 2 decades of American cinema in a way that very few actors ever have. Through the 1970s and well into the 1980s, he built one of the most impressive runs any leading man has put together, from Jeremiah Johnson to The Sting to All the President's Men. He directed Ordinary People and won the Oscar for it. He founded the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, creating an entirely new pipeline for independent filmmakers at a moment when that kind of support didn't really exist anywhere else. Long after his leading man years had passed, he was still actively reshaping how directors got their start and which films found their audience. His influence moved well behind the camera and stayed there. Robert Redford died on the 16th of September 2025 at his home in the mountains of Utah. He was 89 years old, surrounded by family, and the tributes that followed lasted for days. Directors, actors, journalists, and filmmakers, whose entire careers had been touched by Sundance, all came forward to say what he'd meant to them. It felt, across the industry, like the closing of a whole chapter in American film history. For Elliott, that grief carries a weight that almost nobody else paying tribute that week could honestly claim to share. He wasn't mourning a peer he'd competed against for roles through the 70s. He wasn't reminiscing about decades of friendship built on shared dinners and mutual admiration. He was the anonymous kid who happened to be standing at the far edge of the frame when something genuinely historic was being filmed around him, close enough to witness it, too unknown to be noticed by anyone involved. That particular kind of loss sits differently, and it clearly still does. Sam Elliott was a background face in one of the most consequential films of that entire decade. He's described that brief overlap on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as a strange kind of beginning, watching a man who was already becoming the biggest star in America from the furthest possible edge of the frame. He had no way of knowing then that he'd spend the next 5 decades working in the same industry Redford was actively reshaping, or that he'd one day outlive him and be left to tell people about it. That's what gives the memory its particular weight now. In a way, it simply didn't while Redford was still alive. All those decades of quietly watching a giant's career unfold from a respectful distance suddenly collapsed into the cold finality of an obituary. Elliott is one of the very last people walking around who can honestly say he shared a set with Robert Redford before the rest of the world had fully caught up to what they were witnessing. He was an uncredited footnote, standing at the far edge of a legend's opening act. Now he carries that memory entirely alone, with nobody left from that particular bar scene to remember it alongside him. There's something both haunting and quietly meaningful about that kind of solitary witness. Number 2 is Kurt Russell, and the film is 1993's Tombstone, which many critics still consider the finest Western produced in the last 50 years. Russell played Wyatt Earp opposite Elliott's older brother Virgil, with Bill Paxton rounding out the Earp brothers, and Val Kilmer delivering what became one of cinema's most celebrated scene-stealing performances as the consumptive gambler, Doc Holliday. Kilmer's turn alone could anchor a separate conversation entirely, but the film as a whole was something special. A big, dusty, unapologetically old-fashioned Western that somehow landed harder than anyone expected it to. Behind the scenes, though, the production was in near constant turmoil from the very beginning. Original director Kevin Jarre was fired roughly a month into filming after falling dangerously behind schedule, and from that point forward, Russell quietly became the picture's real creative engine. He worked alongside producer Jim Jacks to reshape the script and tighten the pacing, even though veteran action director George Cosmatos ultimately received the official directing credit once he was brought in to steer things toward the finish line. It was one of those Hollywood arrangements where the credit and the actual work didn't quite match up. That pressure showed up in ways audiences never got to see on screen. Elliott has recalled sitting with Russell in a Holiday Inn before a single frame had been shot, watching him grow visibly anxious over a competing Wyatt Earp biopic starring a red-hot Kevin Costner. That film had a bigger budget, a more powerful studio behind it, and considerably more public anticipation riding on it going in. Kurt was kind of angst-ridden about all of it because he was looking at a much bigger picture than I was, Elliott recalled to Entertainment Weekly. I told him not to worry about it. We had this kind of contentious relationship throughout, and I think it was really born in the relationship of the brothers, and we never got past that. That dynamic never fully resolved itself, even long after the cameras stopped rolling, and the film went on to become a genuine classic. But here's the thing, that unresolved friction between the two men didn't hurt the movie. If anything, it fed it. The tension between Elliott and Russell bled directly into the performances, and what could have been a liability ended up feeling like an asset. The result was something rare in a big studio Western. Virgil and Wyatt Earp didn't feel like actors reciting lines about brotherhood and loyalty. They felt like real, tired, complicated men who actually had history with each other, some of it warm, some of it sharp around the edges. That's not always something you can manufacture on a soundstage, and Tombstone is a better film for the fact that nobody managed to smooth it over before the cameras rolled. That rivalry between the two brothers carries genuine weight, precisely because it wasn't entirely invented for the screen. The friction was real enough to feel it. Tombstone went on to completely outlast its far more expensive competition, eventually becoming one of the most quoted Westerns in the history of the genre, while Costner's Wyatt Earp quietly faded from cultural conversation and never quite recovered its footing. Russell is now in his 70s, still active, still working, and he remains one of the very few people on Earth who shared that specific, once-in-a-generation set with Elliott. That's a bond that doesn't diminish with time. Number 3 on Elliott's list is Ben Johnson, a man Elliott has described not simply as a co-star, but as a living, breathing connection to an entire vanished world of the Western genre. That bond mattered more to him personally than almost any professional recognition he's ever received. Johnson was a genuine, competition-tested rodeo champion long before anyone ever pointed a camera at him. He was born on a working ranch in Osage County, Oklahoma, to a father who had won the World Rodeo Championship 3 times over. His path into Hollywood was pure accident. Howard Hughes discovered him while he was delivering horses purchased for the 1943 production of The Outlaw, a chance encounter that nobody planned, and that ended up launching a 6-decade acting career nobody saw coming. He came up through the craft under the direct guidance of director John Ford, learning the rhythm and discipline of classic westerns across decades of collaboration. Then came the role that changed everything. He won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for The Last Picture Show in 1971. And the story behind how he nearly didn't take that part at all is one of the better ones Hollywood has to offer. Johnson called the script the worst thing he'd ever read. His specific objection was the volume of profanity written into his character's dialogue, language he flat out refused to deliver on screen. It took John Ford personally stepping in and asking him to do it as a personal favor before Johnson agreed to move forward. Once he did, he rewrote his own lines, stripped out everything he found objectionable, took home the Oscar, and never had to say a single one of the words he'd fought against from the beginning. That's a remarkable outcome on every level. By the time Elliott worked alongside him on the 1979 miniseries, The Sackets, Johnson was already something closer to a monument than a man. He played the grizzled, battle-worn Cap Roundtree opposite Elliott's Tell Sackett, and just sharing the frame with him meant something specific to Elliott that went beyond performance. One of the most frequently quoted moments in that miniseries comes when Elliott's character steps in front of a cocky young gunfighter who's thinking about pushing Roundtree too far. He tells the kid that every wrinkle on the old man's face is a war map, earned fighting Indians, grizzlies, and 100 strutting peacocks just like him. It's a line that works as pure drama, but it also reads almost like Elliott's own quiet tribute to the real man standing across from him on that set. The two of them came back together 3 years later for The Shadow Riders, with Johnson stealing scenes as the rascally, perpetually drunk Uncle Blackjack Traven, bringing a loose, lived-in charm to every frame he appeared in. Off-camera, though, the connection between them ran considerably deeper than any credit list could capture. Johnson had spent years trying to get a personal passion project off the ground, a script called The Outfit that he desperately wanted to see produced. The road was brutal. He lost 2 of his would-be collaborators to death before either one could ever help him get it made. Director Sam Peckinpah and actor Steve McQueen, both gone before the project could take shape. That kind of loss has a weight to it that never really lifts, and Elliott knew exactly what it meant to Johnson. Every year that passed without that film being made, Sam Elliott watched the dream grow a little more distant. Eventually, he handed both the rights and the remaining hope for the project over to Elliott, one old-school cowboy trusting another with something he couldn't finish himself. It was a transfer of faith, a quiet passing of the torch between 2 men who understood exactly what kind of story they were trying to protect. Elliott has never taken that responsibility lightly, even as people close to both men have said plainly that Hollywood simply isn't interested anymore in that particular breed of Western. Ben Johnson passed away in 1996 at the age of 77. Friends didn't remember him primarily as a movie star. They remembered him as something closer to a brother to older Oklahomans and an honorary uncle to the younger generation, a rancher's son who never really shed that identity no matter how many awards the industry placed in his hands. The Oscars, the acclaim, the recognition, none of it changed the essential thing about him. Elliott has been carrying that unfinished script for nearly 30 years now. There's no glamour in that kind of loyalty. No red carpet moment, no press release, no tribute reel capturing what it actually means. It's just one old cowboy holding on to a dead friend's last wish, still waiting for an industry that moved on long ago to somehow give him a reason to finally let it go. There's something almost painfully moving about that image when you sit with it. A man in his 80s, still keeping a promise made decades ago, to someone who can no longer ask for an update. Still hoping, against every commercial instinct driving modern Hollywood, that the film might somehow reach a screen before there's no one left alive who remembers why it mattered in the first place. That kind of quiet, stubborn devotion doesn't make headlines. It doesn't generate buzz or trend on social media. It just exists, steady and private, the way the best things in that old genre always did. It isn't the sort of tribute you'd find in an obituary. It's a man doing exactly what he was asked for as long as it takes, because that's what the genre both of them loved, always demanded from the people who gave their lives to it. Number 4 on this list is Tom Selleck, the co-star with whom Elliott has shared his most natural and sustained on-screen chemistry. The two were first paired as brothers Tell and Orrin Sackett in 1979's The Sacketts, an adaptation drawn from 2 Louis L'Amour novels. 3 years later, they reunited as Mac and Dal Traven in The Shadow Riders. Both productions became minor television landmarks, and the reason audiences responded so strongly had everything to do with how effortlessly these two men played off each other. Critics noticed it. Fans noticed it even more. There was a visible, lived-in camaraderie between Selleck and Elliott across both projects, the kind of easy rapport that no casting director can manufacture on a page. Selleck brought a loose, sunny warmth to his performances, while Elliott countered with that familiar, coiled intensity, and the contrast worked beautifully. Viewers, discovering these films for the first time decades later, still talk about the two of them, not as a casting pairing but as a genuine brotherhood, which is about the highest compliment you can give two actors working in that tradition. The connection ran deeper than the screen, too. The same year The Sacketts aired, both Elliott and Selleck traveled to the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City, alongside Ben Johnson and author Louis L'Amour himself, to accept an award honoring the miniseries. 4 men who genuinely belonged to the Western tradition, standing together in one room at a moment that now feels almost symbolic. The whole genre was shifting at that point, moving out of movie theaters and settling onto television screens for the first time, and there they all were, right at the center of that transition, carrying the thing forward the only way they knew how. Tom Selleck became a household name that same year, stepping into the role of Thomas Magnum on Magnum P.I., and transforming into one of television's defining stars almost before anyone saw it coming. It was the kind of overnight breakthrough that changes everything. Sam Elliott, by contrast, kept laying down a slow, methodical body of work, building a filmography so deeply rooted in authenticity that it eventually carried him all the way to Yellowstone, 1883, and Landman decades down the road. When the two of them appear together publicly now, well into their 80s, the comfort between them reads immediately. No awkwardness, no performance for the cameras, just two men who genuinely like each other. They built that bond on a pair of westerns most audiences overlooked at the time, films that never got the credit they deserved outside of the devoted fans who quietly treasured them. Coming in at number 5 is a name that doesn't quite fit the typical co-star category. This is Katherine Ross, the woman who has been Sam Elliott's wife for 41 years now. What's remarkable about their story is how early it almost started. Their paths first crossed in 1969 on the set of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, one of the most celebrated westerns ever made. Ross was at the center of that film, playing the female lead opposite Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Elliott, meanwhile, was barely a footnote in the credits, listed as card player number 2 in a bar scene. He was an extra, background, practically invisible. They never exchanged a single word on that set. Years later, Ross said plainly that she had no memory of him from those days at all. He simply hadn't registered. And given where each of them stood in the industry at that moment, that's hardly surprising. "I didn't dare try to talk to her then," Elliott has said. She was the leading lady. I was a shadow on the wall, a glorified extra in a bar scene. Ross herself described it as a missed connection that neither of them even knew had happened. Two people standing a few feet apart on the same film set, with no idea their lives would eventually become completely intertwined. Nearly a decade went by before they crossed paths again. This time, the circumstances were very different. It was 1978, and both were cast in the horror film The Legacy, shot on location in London. They played a couple drawn into something deeply unsettling inside a creepy English estate. This time, they were genuine co-stars, with real scenes to share, real time to spend together between takes. And off-screen, something shifted between them that the cameras never captured. Asked what first drew her to him, whether it was the baritone voice, the rugged presence, or that mustache, Ross kept her answer refreshingly simple. Probably all that and more. She said, "We were working together, and one thing led to another. Straightforward, honest, and somehow exactly what you'd expect from two people who've never seemed particularly interested in performing their own love story for anyone else's benefit." It was her fifth marriage, and his very first. They wed in 1984, and within that same year they welcomed their daughter, Cleo Rose. The life they built together was deeply personal, but their creative partnership ran almost parallel to it, stretching across 4 decades without ever really stopping. Ross appeared alongside Elliott and Ben Johnson in The Shadow Riders in 1982, which technically makes her a presence in 2 separate entries on this list. She was already part of his world professionally before they even made it official personally, which says something about how naturally the 2 dimensions of their relationship overlapped. Then in 1991, they came together again for Conagher, a television adaptation of a Louis L'Amour novel that Elliott co-wrote himself. He's spoken about that project with a kind of pride he doesn't always attach to his work publicly. It earned him a Golden Globe nomination and sits, by his own account, among the genuine highlights of his entire career. Not just because of the material, but because of who he got to make it with. "Working with Katherine is incredible for me," he said. "It's always been. 41 years of marriage, multiple films together, and he still means it. That's not something you hear very often in this industry." In 2014, they even took their bond beyond the screen and onto the stage together, performing the two-hander play Love Letters at a Massachusetts theater as a personal favor to a close friend who was fighting cancer. That performance said everything about who they are to each other, that this wasn't a vanity project or a publicity move. It was 2 people quietly showing up for someone they cared about. And decades after that first missed connection at a Hollywood party, the rest of the world got to see exactly what Katherine means to him. Accepting a Screen Actors Guild Award for 1,883 in 2023, Elliott turned away from the audience at the end of his speech and looked directly at her, right there in the room, in front of everyone. "Thank you to my wife, my beautiful Katherine, my partner through thick and thin, and the mother of our beautiful daughter." When asked what actually keeps a 41-year Hollywood marriage intact, in an industry that's been pulling couples apart since the studio era, Elliott's answer has never wavered. It's the same thing he's been saying for decades, and there's a reason it still lands. "I think really what it boils down to is we love each other and we work at it," he said. "It takes wanting to be married. That's not a polished answer crafted for a magazine profile. That's just the truth, worn smooth by repetition because he actually believes it." Taken together, these 5 names map out the full arc of everything Sam Elliott has spent 60 years chasing in this business. Each one represents a different chapter, a different lesson, a different piece of what it cost him to become the person he is now. Redford represented the era he arrived just in time to witness from the edges, a glimpse of a kind of stardom he wouldn't reach himself for another 2 decades, and whose recent passing has left Elliott as one of the last people still standing who can say he was genuinely there at the very beginning of it. That's a weight that doesn't lift easily. Russell represented the moment Elliott finally earned his place at the true center of a genre-defining Western, friction and all. Their tension on the set of Tombstone wasn't a footnote, it was proof that two strong-willed men, with deeply held convictions about the same material, can still produce something audiences return to 30 years later. Ben Johnson represented something harder to replace. He was a living thread connecting Elliott back to a version of the American West that was already vanishing when Elliott first picked up a script. A direct line to the real thing, to men who had actually lived some version of those stories. And for nearly 30 years since Johnson's death, Elliott has been carrying that thread forward as carefully and faithfully as he knows how. Selleck represented something different again, the easy, unforced brotherhood that made two modest television westerns feel like something far bigger than their budgets. The friendship that built up across those productions wasn't manufactured for press. It was real, and audiences have always been able to tell the difference. People still discover those films today and feel the warmth of it. And then there's Katherine. She represented the one co-star who turned out to be a life sentence, in the very best sense of that phrase. The missed connection at 20-something that finally became the truest and most lasting partnership of his life by the time he was in his 40s. Some people spend their whole careers chasing that kind of chemistry on screen and never quite find it. He found it in real life, which is the rarer thing by far. Two of these five people are gone now, and Elliott carries both of those losses differently than any standard Hollywood tribute would suggest. Redford is a distant, reverent memory of a legend he barely knew personally but still feels a deep obligation to honor, the way you honor someone who shaped the road you eventually walked down yourself. Johnson is something else entirely, an active, unfinished promise that Elliott still hasn't found a way to release, even 30 years on. That kind of grief doesn't follow a timeline. Two are still out there working, still occasionally turning up beside him at events and on screens, long after those original westerns first aired. That kind of professional bond is genuinely rare. Most working relationships in Hollywood have a natural expiration date, driven by scheduling, by agents, by shifting careers. The ones that survive all of that and still feel warm decades later are something worth paying attention to. And one has been standing right next to him, on screen and off, for more than 4 decades, without interruption. No gaps, no estrangements, no quiet drift apart. Just a partnership that kept choosing itself, year after year, long after most people stopped expecting it to last. Katharine Hepburn is the only name on that entire list he never had to walk away from when the cameras stopped rolling. Every other co-star, every other friend, every other chapter eventually closed. That one didn't. Elliott is 81 now, and more of the people and places on that list belong to the past than to whatever comes next. But he keeps circling back to the same story, the same faces, the same stretches of open country, because that's where the real man lives, not in the roles, not in the awards conversations. In the story itself, he's been shaped just as much by the goodbyes as by everything still standing. The losses carved something into him that no screenplay could have written, and the ones still beside him, the ones who stayed, they tell you the rest of it. If this look back at the westerns that built Sam Elliott's career meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are decades of stories still waiting behind that mustache and that voice, more than any single list could ever do justice to. This was just the beginning of what that man's life actually holds. We'll see you in the next one.